Okay, good afternoon everyone here and online. My name is Camillo Boano, and on behalf of the Development Planning Unit here at UCL, I'm welcoming you all to this final public event. Final because we spent today all together with different colleagues discussing and reflecting on social housing. And you see the title of the workshop that we have had. I won't indulge in any longer presentation. I'm just really happy to see many people, friends and colleagues here and many other connected. The final event is an opportunity for us to continue the conversation, and we are very pleased to have three different speakers that have spent most of their academic, intellectual, activist, personal career working and discussing on the subject of housing that we know be very longitudinal, transversal, certainly very global, and certainly very prominent and very in the present moment. The event is organized by the Development Planning Unit, Andrea Rigon, Valentina, Alex, that have helped across the different months of preparation. Of course, without their work, it wasn't possible to do that. Has been funded by UCL and the Development Planning Unit with the support of the Urban Laboratory at the Bartlett in UCL. I'm going to introduce Alan Gilbert, Professor Alan Gilbert, who will introduce the speakers. And then after the event, we're going to have, for those who are here, of course, lucky to have another moment of celebration with a glass of wine and another set of conversation. So without any further ado, and just another technical issue that I always forget is that the session has been recorded, and therefore if anybody has any issue, please get in touch with us. Super happy to have Professor Alan Gilbert. Professor Alan Gilbert is emeritus professor in the University College of London, and have been spent numbers of years working and researching across different parts of the globe on social housing. And I let him, and I'm very pleased to have him leading the session and having a discussion with Massimo Bricoccoli and Raquel Rolnik. So thank you very much. And I'm just literally disappearing here.
Okay, right. For my sins, I was appointed as moderator. You don't know what you're doing, but anyway, and I laid down some rules which are 20 minutes for Massimo, 20 minutes for Raquel, 5 minutes discussion about their specific points. Then after Raquel, I'm going to take liberty of a 10-minute presentation, and then it's open to you guys for public discussion and attack us all equally vehemently. Okay, so I'm going to leave Massimo. I'm not going to introduce them both because the CVs are there. You've all got copies. If you haven't read it, then when you finish, read it, please. But I'd rather listen to them than tell everybody what they ought to know anyway.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. It's also very interesting to give a contribution after a whole day of workshop, because many of the issues that I will speak about have been discussed, and I'm really glad to have met many colleagues who are struggling on similar questions. So I'm discussing about planning and the challenges of social housing and affordability with a reference to Milano. And I also added the names of the colleagues who are working together, because it's really a kind of collective work that we are doing since some years. And I will not get into the frame of Italy too much, but just a couple of images just to consider that it's in any case relevant to consider that I'm coming from a country where housing policies in itself are much weaker than they are in public housing policies are much weaker than in other Northern European countries. And so the proportions, the quantities of housing which has been produced by the public are much limited, as well as the forms of tenure are very different. So Italy is located after the whole set of Eastern European countries where property home ownership is very high, and far before countries like Great Britain, where there is a higher proportion of private rental and of social rental. So this is important because, as we discussed today also, these are structural conditions which give different relevance to different phenomena. But what we learned today is how much some trends are common. And so there is a kind of subtitle that I added to my presentation in the last days, and I realized it's really relevant. And it's new social housing, so new forms of social housing and the irresistible attraction of unearned rent. And this, with a focus on an attractive city like Milano, this is very relevant. We have been writing a chapter with Angelo Salento on this issue, and it's could be shared. But it's interesting to refer to trends which are very general, like considering how after the Second World War we had a time in which housing was highly politicized. So there was a public debate, there was fights for right to housing, and then more and more the politicization of housing issues. And nowadays, I would say in a post-crisis period, depoliticization plus financialization. And financialization is really affecting also the provision of what we will call new social housing. So there are different contributions and researchers showing how also in Italy there was a kind of state-led, public-led financialization of the production of social housing. And there are interesting features that we can detect into this development. Considering Italy, for example, in 2008, a new definition was introduced of social housing. And we didn't have it before because we always discussed about public housing, cooperative housing, and private. And then this definition of social housing was somehow very vague, and it opened to a variety of quasi-market solutions that are eligible for state incentives and co-funding schemes. And this changes completely the scene. And public housing was rapidly left aside in favor of envisioning these new socially and functional mixed housing environments, which offer investors the opportunity to enter the social rental housing segment with the benefit of public support. And so the extraction of value found new pathways. Many social housing projects were clearly targeting lower middle income groups and have been funded by actors from the banking system. A very strong call for social mix, which is somehow very functional to target a public that is financially secure. So the impoverished lower middle class, which is economically weak, but still can face the rent costs. And university students, for example, who have a good spending capacity because they have the support provided by families and universities. So this orientation results in the further relegation of the poorer portion of those who are in need into shrinking public housing stock. And we saw at the beginning how small the public housing stock is in our country. So the developers of new social housing are somehow prescribing and determining the overall conditions with a very strong focus on, there was a strong focus in the past decade on economic and financial sustainability. So every project has to sustain itself to have the investors, these social investors, ready to invest. And so new social housing projects tend to clearly to capture the increase of cost rather than counteracting it. And this it also shows across the country. I will not get into the difference, but between northern Italy cities and southern Italy cities, there is a great difference. So most of this new social housing was profitable in the most attractive cities and not feasible at all in the others. But also politically, the agenda was very much shifting into this definition. And there is a position that was expressed during an interview by the head of a major non-profit social housing organization. Sorry, not non-profit, of a major new social housing organization backed by Bank Foundation, which I found really emblematic, because she said, if real estate prices rise in the city, we are very happy, as it means that our properties also gain value. And I think this, for me, it was really illuminating. And I would say this was 10 years ago, and I think it's also an issue because when I started to express critical perspectives on this kind of interpretation of social housing, you really felt like a fool, like a crazy, like an outsider, because the debate, also academically, a lot of research was put on these new options. So if we focus on an attractive city like Milano, I think then the issue of how affordable housing or how affordability is challenging planning and housing policies gets really more tough. Because on the one hand, there was the defunding of the public housing production and right to buy, so a lot of stock was sold. The end of rent control, this was a national law, and so rent is not controlled anymore. New public-private urban regeneration programs in a city like most of cities which have been undergoing deindustrialization, so regeneration of large vacant areas, the end of public housing production, and then more and more residualization of public housing and the marketization of social housing supply in the years. And moreover, and this is a very relevant issue for Milano nowadays, it's a new frontiers, so new perspectives for an attractive city and the success of Milano after the Expo, which has really setting a turn in the city. So if we go through the media also, what was the representation of Milano? In 2009, Milano was defined by the Financial Times as Europe's Cinderella, so a city which was left behind, gray, not attractive. It was never an attractive city for tourists. It was the economic center of Italy, but somehow in a very quiet phase. And in 2015, when we had the Expo, the New York Times was declaring Milano as a place to be, the best place to go among 52 cities in the world. And on the 27th February this is a mistake, 2020, so 3 days after the starting of the COVID-19 lockdown, the mayor was declaring Milano doesn't stop, which, so there is a video which is quite impressive, suggesting that in the face of this emergency, Milano would react. And this was just 3 days after the crash that the COVID pandemic brought. So this also tells about the attitude of the city in the recent years, the trends, the dynamics. This is an image in April 2020 during the lockdown. It's a series of photos of all the public of the advertisements in the city turned white. But it was a kind of suspended time for the city, which lasted, I would say, very short. It's very representative of a city that in 2019 was also declared a star is born. These are the investments on over 5 million euros concerning more than 10 apartments in the city. So from 2015, the trend increased and increased and increased. And, and also the population started to increase rapidly. And I will not get into the details of the Milano metropolitan area, but it's what is clear, what you see at the center is the administrative borders. And more and more, when we say Milano, we always refer to the city within the borders. And the rest, there is really no strategy for qualifying the metropolitan region. So the tension is very strong in the central city, strong expectation of rising of inhabitants. So raising real estate values, raising population as indicators of success. And this is the distribution of housing prices in the metropolitan region, which is really, you really see the borders of the city clearly defined. When you leave the borders, the prices decrease, but all the living conditions clearly decrease, and most of all the attractive functions are within the city limits. So this is the stock of public housing in the city of Milano. You see, it's really limited, and it's very often in semi-central conditions. So there is a very strong pressure. A lot of it is decaying. It's accessible. It's valuable. I mean, it's an interesting also built stock. It's an important heritage from the 20s onwards. But it's really in a very critical condition as investments are very low. So in 2023, both the regional housing company and the city of Milano owned a total of 62,000 public dwellings. This is public. But 8,000 of them are vacant because of lack of upkeep and investment. So they are empty flats, vacant flats, and the reason is that there is no funding to improve them. The average amount for refurbishing a flat is 30,000 euros, so very limited. And all across these years, these flats remained vacant because of the lack of funds. There are in the registered waiting list 22,000 people registered for waiting, and definitely more would be entitled for public housing. And the last public housing projects were developed in 2008. So there was no more, when in the data you see some new public housing is simply the refurbishment of existing dwellings that are available again. So I would say one first issue that we really focus a lot on is to put energies, intelligence, research, support in these public housing estates. There is a lot to do because given the residual attitude, the population is increasingly selected among the most in need. And so in the red buildings, you see, it's a new project for introducing more adequate ways of managing the existing stock. So with a very strong emphasis on making these places, these estates, places for inclusion, while they tend to be spaces of relegation and segregation in the city. Some images of the regeneration projects which started, this is the first, the very pioneer in '84, which have created now new neighborhoods where housing is very consistent, but it's definitely a kind of housing which tends to have a very different target. It's private. These were very central areas with industries. And in the best conditions like this, you had at that time a proportion also of public housing. So 25% of the housing was considered to be public. But this is less and less the case. And these are the new areas in which development is occurring. They are all railway yards. And in these cases, the tension is very strong, and it's really new forms of what is defined social housing, which is no, which we are questioning more and more, as we also discussed today, because by law they are social, a proportion of them is being sold, and the kind of image they have is, no, they are fully into the market of the cities. And the criteria for accessing this housing, no, are open to higher, so to lower middle income wages. So in such a city, this is a very recent image, no? The discussion that in the debate, no, this sentence that is a quotation, there is no alternative. There is no chance to produce different housing, and that's the market. And the comparison with other cities across Europe show that everything everywhere is the same. And I would say that from our position also as researchers, university, we are quite engaged in the city, and we have quite a role also in the public debate. We somehow decided to produce a shift and to work on the notion of affordability. So of putting the issue of going back to some basics, which we also discussed today, but realizing that any word referring to social housing had lost the meanings. And we started to understand how we could somehow reset the public debate, how we could qualify the public debate, and eventually also the public agenda. And as before, I was quoting that sentence about, well, if the cost of housing rise, we are happy because also social housing has a higher value. There was a moment in which we were interviewing inhabitants of a co-op, which is the first ever founded in 1879. And there was a tenant who was saying, yes, people in our homes enjoy a long life. A member who died last month was very old. Sorry, I don't see because there is the... Okay, I see. It was 170 years, another 98. We have a very good life. Many would think we are from a higher social class than the one we belong to. And you know why? Because we are light-hearted. Our rents are low, and what we save in housing costs is released for other options, which become affordable. And we can eat filet and live better and longer. And this sentence for us was very revealing, no? And I would say from that moment, from that interview with the younger colleagues, we thought, well, this is the issue, no? So cooperatives, no, they disappeared in the debate, and we started to go back to the role of cooperatives and to this notion of affordability, which is interesting because we don't have it in Italian. It's used we use the English term, and then we even founded a new word that we robbed it from the French. The French don't like to use English words, so we were stealing the word from the French. You will see. So in this sense, we started to rediscuss housing as a fundamental infrastructure for the everyday life, and discussing the different conditions that allow a dwelling to be a necessary context within a worthy life can develop. So as we saw also today, yes, lower housing costs can release economic resources that can increase material well-being and individual flourishing. So that's the word we started to use, abordability. The French would say abordabilité. And sounds very nice, very effective, very adequate in Italy and in Italian. And yes, we refer to the relation between housing costs and income and wages, because we realize that in the whole public debate, in the documents, in the laws, this was completely lost. So a discussion and also like making it explicit which are the costs, the final costs, the rent costs, the prices per square meters, and not just in a very vague sense, and the incomes, and more specifically the wages. So this is an issue that was raised in the time in which housing was highly politicized, and it was lost. The trade unions never went back to these issues. And we founded an initiative, an observatory, which is called OCA. an observatory on the affordability of housing in Milano. And it's based at the university, but it's funded by by a federation of cooperatives and by a cooperative, Delta Ecopolis, which are supporting with a moderate amount of money, and who have started to support us in this work. And we had to turn quantitative. We have a different tradition. We never worked on statistics, on data so much as we are doing in these recent years, and we had to, because we wanted to collect and to share data which were not existing. This is also a main difference. In Italy, we don't have so strong housing departments, housing studies, so to collect data is very difficult. It's a very hard job. The past year was mainly dedicated to collecting data. So here you see, for example, the building permits in Milano for new residential units by year. The red is the cooperative. The yellow are the public housing, but it's just refurbishment. And you see the proportion of the private developer. And the percentage of the cooperatives, which was higher in the past, is being very decreased a lot. And this is the different rental contracts, where you can see lungo termine is long term, more than 3 years, decreasing, and a very substantial increase of short term contracts, which year after year allow rents to increase. So we started to compare the trends of average rent price, considering them per square meter in relation to the income. And I would, this is the average rent price per square meter in Milano, and we are working on the different sources, very tough. These have been increasing a lot, and we work starting from 2015, because, as I said, Expo was really the turning point, and you see a constant increase of rental cost per square meters. We work on the income. Milano has one of the average higher incomes in Italy, but it's interesting to see how it is distributed, because more than 57% of the Milanese taxpayers have less than 26,000 euro per year. So the issue is how incomes are distributed. And we started to produce this data. So to see, to make it explicit according to the different qualification and to the different monthly net salary, how much square meters you can afford. And it's interesting because the first line is the blue collar. This is the definition that it's given by the statistics. But blue collar, that's the average. So 1,500 is the average salary of a graduate of Politecnico di Milano. So the average of an engineer, architect, designer from Politecnico di Milano, the average income salary is 1,500. So it's also interesting to make this explicit and to discuss that we have this category of blue collar, which is really, really modern, and to say, okay, but which are the salaries of our graduates in Milano, in such a successful city? And to see, of course, when you see that you can afford 32 square meters or 23, the minimum dimension of a flat is by law 24. So this is the minimum size of a flat as it is defined by law in Italy. So this we are quite, on the one hand glad, on the other hand very worried, because these succeeded a lot. I mean, discussing the issue of affordability in these ways was opening up the debate, not only at the city level, but at the national level. We were hearing before, there is now a protest undergoing in Milano since May. It concerns the students, university students. They have put tents in front of Politecnico di Milano. There are students from all over, all the universities and different cities. And they are protesting because students are the most exposed at the moment. And we are very worried also for university, for students and for researchers and for PhD candidates. We are risking to lose good candidates and to have only the locals who are backed by the families. And the discussion on the media, has gained a new momentum. And it's not a discussion about social housing. It's not a discussion about affordable housing by itself, but it's really very much putting under observation the issue of the cost of living and of incomes. And this somehow was the turning point we expected and we intended to produce. So, thank you.
Hold on for a moment. 5 minutes of questions, specific to Milano. None?
Maybe just thanks a lot for your presentation. It was very interesting actually to see these data and to better understand the context in Milan. Mine is just a minor question to understand something. When you calculate the square meters that are affordable for people depending on their income, is there a difference between shared flat, like having to leave up to a certain age also together with other people, versus being able to afford even at 32 square meters? Because 32 square meters when it's in a kind of shared flat might be more affordable versus living alone. So I was just wondering whether you were also observing these differences.
I would say the data we are working on, we have the official data, which are the recorded contracts, so for rents, and then there are the platforms. And this already is a very big issue because the platforms tend to give over. So we always expect that given the price on the platform, there is some negotiation. But it's interesting. The city of Milano is using the platform prices as reference, which again. So we are struggling, and we are also sharing with other observatories across Europe this issue of how you can mediate, how you can collect good data. It's not specified if these are shared flats, of course. And the whole issue of shared flats, we have been working on that, because it's a very it was very unknown, because shared flats used to be for students, but now there is an incredible amount of people, of grown-ups who are sharing. Yeah. And so this is absolutely obscure. There is also the kind of contracts you have, the subcontracts. Now we are in a situation in which it's not only sharing the apartment, it's sharing even a bed. If you go to lower incomes or to newcomers, migrants, it's sharing beds. So this is the informal market. It needs much more investigation.
Okay. So one more question at the back.
Massimo, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the discussions on even the definition of affordability. We know from here in the UK it's related to the market value, not people's capacity to pay. And there has been ongoing conversations that affordability should be not more than a third of household income. So could you tell us a little bit more about those discussions? How you define it?
Sorry, I skipped the sentence in which it was written. Yes, we assume the 30% as a reference. And I would say it was the first time that this proportion was introduced in the debate, and even in institutions, this notion of 30%, and we simply said 30% is recognized internationally as a reference. Then you could discuss, because of course now the cost of heating, for example, increase, or of cooling. In many situations, cooling is really an issue. So this we are not even getting into the details of this, but we felt the need of introducing this in the debate because there was no reference at all, as well as the cost for square meters. I know by experience in Germany, Austria, countries in which we have been doing research, there are clear references to square meters, and this was not at all in the debate. So you could never understand what cost are we speaking about, for what kind of flat, what size.
Are you including utilities, water, electricity?
No.
In that? Okay, so that, I don't know how expensive those are in Milano, but that here it would be a big issue. Okay, right, I'm going to cut it to give Raquel her chance. Right, I'm not really going to introduce her because her CV is online. You all got it. She's well known anyway, so you know who she is. So over to you for your 20 minutes.
So, hello everybody. I'd rather be standing, but it's be impossible because those online ones, I can't see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation, for the opportunity to share with you discussions, experience, and reflections on housing and housing justice and the challenges we are facing globally. I would start by saying that a new colonial power, which is flagless and faceless, occupy and seize our territories, transforming landscapes and forms of life everywhere. And I could call it financialized digital neoliberalism, on the lack of better definitions. It's very wide, but I think it's coming with new meanings for an old history of dispossession and extractivist occupation, and especially coming from São Paulo, Brazil. I'm talking also about the periphery of capitalism. But I think it's also true, as we have seen, at the center of capitalism as well nowadays. Historically, yes, in the periphery of capitalism, the juridical order was established in order to define as legal and proper only the bonds with the territory based on property, an individual property registered under the abstract and mathematic signs of cadastres, and all other forms of tenure or links with the territory were stigmatized, eventually criminalized as well. And all the forms that have no direct links with the domination of the territory towards amplifying the scale and the generation and accumulation of capital was stigmatized and residualized. But yes, this is the history that we know. So that was before neoliberalism, financialization, and all that. It's an old history, 250 years, I think. But here we are referring to a more recent transformation, which articulate changes in the political economy of work, and I'm talking about Uberization of work, precariousness, and all that. We are talking about production, circulation, and accumulation, changes in the ways production, circulation, and accumulation and its relationships with state, with the material and symbolic destruction of the welfare state everywhere, even in places that had never had a welfare state. But the illusion of a welfare state is also destroyed as well, dismantled, under the hegemony and the command of finance and the times and forms of digital economies. So we are talking about a spatial temporal compression and the dictatorship of algorithms by which capital can be extracted, mobilized, accumulated, and invested on betting on future value. So this is speculation. Speculation is betting on future value. This is part of the game. Here, what interests us is to understand how built space had gained a very central role in these finance circuits, operating in the direction of concentration because of titularization, or the ability of bringing new mechanisms and tools, instruments and tools, both planning instruments and financial instruments that allow a velocity, a speed, and a scale which is absolutely new, of extracting income, extracting interests from spaces. So we are talking about investment funds and other financial agents which are absolutely deterritorialized. So it's an electronic cloud that just is over the planet, and it's able to move very quickly and enter and exit from built space because of these new instruments and on the speed of electronics and digital economy. So in a bit, a capital can come in and come out. And so what are the effects, and it's the disaster effects of this capture of territories? It's basically the rise of more process of dispossession. So the picture that we saw, like everybody getting out of Milan, this is basically a metaphor of everywhere. And the capture of built space and housing in particular by process of speculation. So I used to call this the building of rent-seeking landscapes, which have nothing to do with needs and necessities of life. They have to do with the needs and necessities of the capital that invested in order to build them, period. So they are built there. They are universal products that are built everywhere. So, but they, although they have nothing to do with our needs, they capture the material territory. So they take over parts, strengths of our cities from the possibilities of building landscapes for life, which is basically the idea of building places where we can live, work, have our cultural activities, etc., etc. So this is an outlet for a surplus capital, surplus financial capital, which is absolutely global, which have no links at all with real needs. But we, poor guys that live actually in the city, we have to compete with this capital in order to get a place. So we compete with this possibility of this capital to do that. So it's a war in which guess who is winning, who has the possibilities of paying more for land, because basically the prices of land, the prices of rent have nothing to do with the incomes of the people in the cities, have to do with the amount of global surplus capital which is ready to come and arrive in the city. That's why it's so damn expensive. So we are competing with oil sheikhs, with sovereign funds of Germany, of plutocrats from China and Russia. We are competing with pension funds, with our savings, which is also circulating all over the places, looking for where to park in order to be bigger, in order to assure our poor pensions that don't exist anymore. So over this order, now I want to land, because this is global, yes, but it's specific in every place, because it depends on political economy of land and housing in every place, and it's pet dependent also on that. But thinking from Brazil, from Latin America, from the periphery of capitalism in principle, I'm talking about what happened also with places, because yes, we have in São Paulo or in Bogota or in Mexico City or in Lagos, yes, a part of the city which is absolutely equal other parts of London or Milan or other cities in North America. But yes, we have also a large part of cities which were the product of larger processes of dispossession from rural areas due to migration and many processes like that, but that were self-produced, a self-produced habitat that is being permanently negotiated with the state in between the normative apparatus of the state, the repressive force of the state that can evict or say, no, here, no, you go away, but also negotiate, yes, I can give you some time to stay, I give you a little light here, a little school there, and then you vote me in the next elections. So it's permanently done through that, through a very discretionary way of governing, very clientelistic way of governing. But yes, we are talking about a regime that operates permanently under so regimes of permanent transitoriness, as if nobody knows if there will be forever, they will disappear, will be under threat of eviction or displacement, or stay forever. And it's a permanent denial of full citizenship, because it's a negotiated citizenship, forever negotiated citizenship. But what happened with this neoliberal digital financialized era in this process of production of capital? So I think it's important to understand that when we are talking about new forms, we are not just talking about corporate capital and the state, which was the first part of my talk, but we are talking also about processes that are happening from below and are happening within the process of self-production of habitat and changing it very rapidly in many different directions, transforming the forms of life, the symbolic and material dimensions, the political dimensions of building habitat and low-income habitat very, very quickly, very, very quickly. So here I just throw on the table as a provocation to our debate some elements to understand this restructuring that is going on also from below, not only at the corporate state level, saying that at the corporate state level, we had a first wave of financialization of housing, which was around homeownership and the promotion of homeownership through mortgages, through credit. But then the second wave of financialization, which happened after the 2008 financial crisis, was financialization of rent. So new landlordism, corporate landlords, new forms of rent extraction, Airbnb, and digital platforms, rental platforms are also very, very important ways of this change. I'm saying that because I think it's important also to relate that to informality. So after 2008, after the financial and mortgage crisis, corporate landlords, Airbnb, housing became the new definition of the same actors that provoked the crisis, the financial crisis, by the way, the same investment funds. Housing became a service which means exploitation of time, not space, time of using the place. Always mobilizing state policy, stately. I remember coming here to the UK in the middle of the financial crisis, and the government said, let's have a professional corporate sector, rental sector. Let's build a professional as a response to the crisis. So, I mean, it's absolutely true public policies. So, in the popular territory, in the self-help habitat, what is happening is that this new form of exploring, which is rent, which has been always there, but in terms of Latin America, for instance, is growing madly. Today, around 25 to 30% of housing in self-built communities are rented homes, not squatter, not homeownership. They're rented homes. So here we go. We have to overcome now. We have the possibility to overcome the historical limit that was blocking financial capital to enter and penetrate in the popular territory, in the low-income territories, which was the imperfect juridical form of property, because it was not full property registered. So let's remember Hernando de Soto thesis saying, oh, let's regularize, let's have everybody have titles and private property, then they will be part of the market. And that didn't work, and we know that did not work. But now the question is not there anymore. Now the idea is that in order to rent out the space, you don't need to prove any property. You don't need to present a property. So what do we have? Airbnb in Brazilian favelas. We have digital platforms in informal settlements, as well as in the part of the corporate real estate financial complex as well. But together with that, and we are talking Airbnb is a global investment fund. I mean, it's exactly the same thing that I was referring, and is extracting interest from the poorest among the poor in low-income communities. The second, we have a surplus of capital that was accumulated in the peripheries and in low-income territories. Why? Both because of economic activities in those activities, settlements, low-income settlements has been always places not only of living but also of working, of economic activities. So there was some capital accumulation over time. We are talking about 30, 40 years. And some capital accumulation, local capital accumulation, that migrates to real estate. We are having a problem here.
Yes. So sorry.
Solved?
Solved.
So this surplus of capital, I'm finishing, is migrating to building to rent in the informal settlements, but also the illicit markets, drug dealing, and all types of illicit markets that took over a lot of low-income communities over time also is invested now in local real estate providing homes. So we are creating here a link between the Uberization in general of society, the flexibilization and informality, providing that even very precarious, a self-built home can be also a place where financial capital can extract rent and income. So now we have to understand the political implications of that, because we are not talking about self-building as original places. More and more informal settlements are economic and financial business as well, and taken over by that. So I just throw the question for our debate: what are the implications of this process for the historical struggles and resistance against dispossession process? Thank you.
Well, apart from what you said, can I congratulate you on sticking to 20 minutes? Questions, please. No questions?
This is an emergent phenomenon you're arguing, and I'm interested in the degree to which you think the emergence is affected by the algorithms of the networks that support, I don't know, Airbnb, Uber, whatever, the degree to which the legislation of the local legislative system or the regulatory systems are involved. How do these rule-based systems interact with just straight emergent markets?
Yeah. Very good question. I would say that thinking on planning regulations and in its combination with finance regulation, the combination of two is the atomic bomb that have been created in our cities. Because contrary with the liberal belief that, let's have states out of the business, let the market take over, it's completely the opposite. Indeed, states and regulation and legislation has been very active in attractive, promoting, offering the city in a tray to investment capital. And I can throw hundreds of examples. For instance, the example of promoting social housing through public-private partnerships, mobilizing a huge amount of state subsidies in order to provide interest to the real estate financial complex and not housing alternatives who those who need. And that is public policy. It's not lack of policy. It's public policy. In terms of these algorithms and the fact that there is no regulations. So rental digital platforms are completely free to operate. They don't even pay any tax, which is also another layer of that. So even more money to the cities and countries is led there. So I think it's really a combination of regulation, of legislation, and algorithms. So I think it's very powerful and for the people, there is no way out. So what are the possibilities? I just give an example just to finish all that. In an example drawn from São Paulo. It's a nice example to illustrate that. A place where people used to live in very precarious conditions, squattering or paying rent for tenements, renting beds in the city center of São Paulo, was destroyed. People were displaced in order to build social housing in a public-private partnership. So this social housing was not accessible for those people who were displaced. So they could not access the social housing, affordable housing, which had nothing to do with the needs of the people. And then in order to compensate the people, because they were displaced and they organized and they demonstrate in the front of the city hall, they receive rental vouchers. Rental vouchers of 400 reais. Okay, so now we have almost 35,000 people living on rental vouchers in São Paulo. 400 reais, the rental voucher, is the basic price of the worst room in the worst favela to rent. So that created the market for rental housing in informal settlements that was induced and fed by those vouchers. So I think this is an example, a very clear example, illustration of what I told you.
Okay. You'll have plenty of opportunity to pursue Massimo and Raquel in the public debate. Okay, so thank you very much. Sorry, I'm looking at my watch so I don't abuse the time. I have problems knowing what social housing is. I know what social housing need is. It's those living in tents, those living with bad overcrowding, those living in accommodations likely to fall down, flooded, earthquakes, etc., etc. And that's could be half the world's population. So how do we solve that problem? I'm going to be very pessimistic. I'm not sure we can. There is a need, obviously, for social housing, particularly in rich countries. We can afford to provide social housing, although we do a pretty bad job of it. So that's what, right. One answer to the problem in developed countries was always to build the equivalent of council housing, state housing for rent. That gradually has fallen out of fashion, partly because governments have refused to raise tax rates and so on, therefore had no money to build social housing, and of course because land prices and building costs were going up, and therefore it became implausible to build social housing. So it used to work in this country, but I don't think it any longer does. In the UK, housing supply has not matched the increased demand, which is why housing prices are going up. Whatever other processes are going on, everybody agrees, Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, Greens, we're not building enough houses. But because for a whole variety of reasons, NIMBYs, financial costs, mortgages rising, interest rate Now, median house prices in England were 8.2 times higher than median wages in 2022. It was 9.1 in 2021, which means that anyone on a median income can't afford to buy a house, which is why renting is going up, as it is in many countries around the world, for the same reason. More than 4 million people in the UK, a rich country, live in substandard or inappropriate accommodation. Not my figures, but they're broadly believable. Public housing programs have only partially worked, and since 1980, government investment in social housing has halved. Right, so we've got a problem. In a rich country like the UK, we're not providing housing. 1 in 10 households in need of housing, however defined, are they've been on the waiting list for more than 5 years. 1 in 10. So we're not providing council housing. Right, in the UK and in Sweden and France and Germany, even Italy, the answer is, well, if house prices are going up, if land prices are going up, tax them. Use that money and increase property prices to provide social housing or housing allowances or vouchers or whatever. But of course, governments haven't been able to do it. Rishi, our dear Prime Minister, has no intention of doing it. And according to Keir Starmer's recent announcements, he's not going to do it either. But that's one of the answers. Will that happen? No. Too few resources. Urban development and services raises property values. Betterment and valorization charges can help finance infrastructure. It's obvious, but governments don't do it. A mansion tax was posed at one stage. There are problems with it, but that's another answer. If you've got a £16 million house, you should be paying some of that to the government to finance public services. But no, we don't do that. You say pay the same council tax in the UK for a £1 million house as you do for a £30 million house. Same council tax. Why? Insane. Wealth taxes and closing, we should have more wealth taxes and we should close the UK tax havens. In the Caribbean, in Guernsey, Jersey, the Isle of Man. It's obvious, but nothing happens. But governments are reluctant to charge property owners more. I understand the Conservatives because their voters are on the whole homeowners and increasing numbers of Labour supporters too. So, okay, so, right. Now, I'm sticking to the global north and the global south. I hate the global south because how can India or parts of China be in the south? As a geographer, that offends me. But anyway, let me stick with the term. In Latin America, the housing deficit, sorry, how do I get rid of these questions, which I can't read my own. Oh, right, thanks, Mark. Right, in Latin America, the housing deficit in 1990 was 38 million homes. 2000, it was 52 million homes. And currently, it's between, I thought I'd updated this, between 42 and 51 million. I've got more recent figures which show that it's actually gone up. Right, sorry, here we are. The housing deficit stands at 23 million units plus a further 43 million houses that aren't fit for purpose. So the housing deficit, I know Raquel doesn't like the term, but it's a crude way of measuring the need. That means that it's gone up and up and up. If that's the case in Latin America, which by global South standards is pretty well governed, what is it in Africa and India and so on? The situation in those countries is far worse. Is social housing the answer? Social housing provision has been at best a poor quality sticking plaster to the shelter problem. It's been used for governments to say they're doing something to help the poor, but mainly it's been used to finance private building companies to build and to create jobs. This was the logic of Pinochet in Chile. It seems to be the logic in Colombia. I think it's the logic in Brazil. So social housing provision has failed because it's been faced with an impossible task. Governments won't build enough, we don't have the resources to build enough, and the demand for social housing is just enormous. Has social housing actually reduced inequality? Well, new social housing areas have been located in the periphery of cities that, to my knowledge, in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and South Africa, they've always been built in the periphery. And I did hear one story that in South Africa, the subsidy for transport by the government was higher than the housing subsidy. Why? Because of all the poor people living in the peripheral housing estates. In Chile, the housing was built under the Pinochet government, which was not a total disaster as a policy, but all the housing estates were built in peripheral areas, making life very difficult for those who lived there, because at the time the metro hadn't expanded to those areas. Okay. Long journeys have made working lives difficult for social areas. The quality of construction, particularly in that I know, in Colombia, has been pretty awful. Not only have we been in bad places, but the quality's not been very good, because people were raking off extra profit for building badly. And even the more successful social housing estates were filled with poor people, so nobody else wanted to move into those areas because they were full of poor people. So these people, homeowners in Chile, couldn't sell because nobody was there to buy. So it was a disaster in some ways. No solution, but better policies would help. Earlier in the afternoon, I asked about governability. You've already sensed that I don't have much faith in most governments. So I don't really have much faith that they will do what I'm suggesting would help the problem. Spend more on infrastructure. Well, actually, in Latin America, governments are doing that. The housing qualitative deficit is improving in proportionate terms. And that's because they're investing in infrastructure, sewage, education facilities, and so on. So there is progress. But there is a lack of taxation. The mayor of Quito told me, 5 years ago, that the average tax on a property in the high-income areas of Quito was $25 a year. Do I have to say more? Stop fostering home ownership as the only solution. In poor countries, some 1.3 million people, households, live in rental accommodation. Nearly all of it created in the informal sector. Settlers who started building their house 40 years ago now have a 2, 3, even a 4-story house, and they rent out large numbers of rooms. This is the rental housing market that is expanding. Everywhere else, on the whole, apart from in the global south, not in the global north, rental housing is not increasing in the formal sector. And of course, what government should be doing is reducing poverty and inequality. Are they doing it? Nah. Right, that happens to be the Colombian figures, but I wasn't meaning to show you. Anyway, I've gone over my 10 minutes. I shall shut up, else I'll be in trouble with the other speakers. Okay, thank you. I don't know how we're going to handle questions from online.
I can moderate that. I can bring those questions. There is one. I can read one of those questions, and then there is only one question so far. So maybe it's online. So
well, presumably it's a debate as well. It's not just questions.
Then they can add more, and I'll bring them.
Yeah.
So Sara Rodriguez is asking, I believe to Massimo, but it's open. Do you have any concerns adopting the term affordability, given it has been used as an empty signifier in the UK and in other places, in particular to refer to housing that is far from financially affordable?
Yes, no, I repeat, I'm sorry because I missed the point in which I should have explained that we are using as a reference to say what is affordable, the 30% of the income of individuals. So, and this is, we are roughly using it with reference only to rent and not to utilities, because there is no way at the moment to work on data concerning utilities. So it's already quite generous, our attitude in the discussion also we had today. I'm glad, because I was also saying to Andrea, I don't have the feeling that in the literature there is a discussion about the difference in the use of the term affordability or affordable housing. Very quickly, also in Italy, the term affordable housing has been introduced, is being used by city administration all in a sudden, so in the last 2 years, and it's extremely vague. And I would say what is really wrong from my perception, but I'm glad that I can share it, because until now I didn't have any confrontation on this, is that if you say affordable housing, it sounds really as a market segment of the offer, but it doesn't say anything about. It's even more vague than social housing. At least social housing was including the public, the council housing, at least in Italy. So no, I think it's if you say affordability, or in Italian we use the word abbordabilità, this clearly refers to a relation with incomes or with wages, salaries, which I think it's even more relevant. I didn't show the map, but Italy is at the moment the last country in overall Europe in terms of trends of salaries. So this also, of course, is relevant for discussion to see if the cost of housing is rising. What about the salaries? Italy is the worst in this moment. So we had really very. So I would respond that what is relevant is to distinguish, and it's not only an issue of lexicon. It's really an issue of contents, and we should really put this issue constantly in the debate. So many fantasies about the creative young people who come to Milano. Okay, fine. It's a very attractive city, fashion, design. What are the salaries? Or what are the conditions?
Any question points?
I have two questions. One related to Milan, and it's more of a query about whether private companies have been acquiring, whether the social housing has been sold to any private companies, like it has happened in other European cities, like in Germany and others. That's one. And the second question is related to the UK, where in the debates on housing affordability, there have been, like when you watch something on TV, there's a rural lobby which says that they don't want cities to expand into what are the rural areas, and they want to protect rural areas. So, so if cities need to be able to accommodate the more people that are coming here, they need to densify. And what do you think are the barriers that, in terms of affordability and how high housing prices already are, that are maybe not allowing that densification to happen?
I actually know more about Latin America and South Africa than I do about UK, but let me have a go at that. We have NIMBYs, which includes actually most of us. We don't want new housing estates next to our house. We don't want electricity pylons to provide electricity next to our house. We don't want onshore windmills next to our house. So something has to be done about the planning regulations. I'm not sure what, but they've got to be eased in some way because they're stopping builders building houses. And since everybody is agreed that there's a shortage of housing relative to rising demand, that's crazy. So we've got to do something about that. That I think that's largely a British problem. I don't know to what extent it would be true in the States or France or Germany. Perhaps other people can provide. But clearly, the planning system which developed here, green belts, garden cities, there's an interesting debate about whether we should build housing on parts of the green belt, because parts of the green belt are really nondescript. They're not very green. So we should be building houses there, but of course there is a lobby that says no. So I don't know whether that's answered your question, but there's something very wrong with our planning system. There's something very wrong with our builders. There's something very wrong with our mortgage system. I can go on and on and on, but we've screwed it up.
There are 2 online questions. Shall I read them and then
Yeah.
maybe add a few others? There's an anonymous one that is asking, in Milan and São Paulo, is foreign ownership an issue? Do government limit or restrict? What are your thoughts on this? And then there's another question from Jose Francisco Vergara. Considering Latin America and the presentation, how can one implement a public housing model in a region strongly influenced by the desire for private ownership? The numbers make it feasible, but the ideology does not. And finally, another question. We know that in Germany and France, renters have better protections, longer tenures, break clauses, etc. How do you explain the difference in approach, and do you think this is sustainable in these countries?
I can say something on in Milano. We didn't have, so public housing was not sold to company. This was not the case all over Italy, but more and more the tendency. So we observed how much these new social housing companies, so they have a clear interest in acquiring the management of social housing, of public housing, and to take over. And so there is now this tension is there, and there is resistance, and it's part of the public housing which is really in bad conditions, really bad conditions, and somehow this disinvestment is opening up to this option. I think now the discussion is getting more tough, and also with some first demonstrations, so I think we have some possibility of resisting, but it's a bit different. And all around Milano or in other cities, what you have is that it's clear many who cannot afford to stay in the city are moving out. And there are options, because also the offer is there, the prices at the moment are lower, but they are quickly rising. The point is that the kind of living conditions you have there are completely different because of connections, so mobility, so public transportation is really very weak. The fact that also the deputy mayor was referring to the newcomers to Milano, but in Milano more than 50% of the households are one-person household.
Yeah.
So it's not families moving out of the city as it used to be. It's singles who really risk to have working in the city and then living in really tough conditions. So I think these are issues that are important. The rents, there is no rent control. There is no more rent control. Beside that, beside the formal rent, then there is the whole system of platforms, which it's completely uncontrolled in Italy, and now it's a raising issue, and this is a national issue, and there is no attitude in regulating it. But meanwhile, cities could have, or there were different means in which cities could have played a role in controlling and regulating a bit.
Yeah. First on foreigners owning property, the question on that. It's not an issue. It's an issue in many cities and countries, including the ones that had promoted with golden visas. You invest in real estate and you become a citizen. I mean, It's outrageous, but it's true. I think including here for some time in the UK.
Oh yes, I mean there is a whole area in Battersea and Vauxhall, high-rise buildings, which is supposedly full of Chinese, but I think it's individual investors on the whole, rather than international property companies. And certainly, I think the Golden Visa ones are living in Hampstead and Highgate, in very affluent. Why the Russians haven't had their properties expropriated as a result of Ukraine, I don't know, but there is that issue. But I really don't know whether it's international property companies, but certainly there's a big, a large number of private citizens from abroad who are buying property. And that's shifting, is leading to property prices going up in certain areas, and therefore poorer people and moving eastwards, particularly into Essex and so on and so forth. So there's, if you look at the census figures, there's some really clear,
But having said that, I think it's important to take into account that property patterns of real estate and residential units is changing. So, of course, there still are individuals, landlord, or single companies, but more and more we are talking about international investment funds, and the capital is international and global, even if the developer is local. So the developer is local, but that doesn't mean that the capital is local, and does not make any difference because any capital is seeking for interest there. So I think what is going on, it's more and more you have international finance going and transforming properties in assets, financial assets, in their profile everywhere, including in markets, what I can affirm in terms of Latin America, because we are researching that clearly, in Sao Paulo, very clearly, in Santiago, Chile, very clearly as well, in Mexico City as well. So it's a reality there. So this is one thing. The other thing was the question on rental housing and regulations and rent regulations. In the previous discussion here this afternoon, we were talking how much not only affordability, but other aspects of housing are important as well. I mean, it's not just something that you can pay, because we're not talking about a commodity. We are talking homes and housing is a sort of a portal to other human rights and other ways. It's access to jobs, to income. It's access to education, to transport. It's much more complex to that. And so not only affordability is one thing, but also security of tenure. So, and the question of security of tenure should be taken in all sorts of tenure, because it's not true. It's one of the biggest lies of the recent policies that home ownership is safer than any others. And why it's a lie? Because it depends, of course, on the market value and all the dynamic of the market. I mean, even if you are a homeowner, depending on the price of utility taxes, you will be priced out of the place and obliged to sell. So the idea here, I think, it's not to defend the ideal model of tenure. Should be public, should be rental. No, but the idea of having security of tenure in any type of tenure, which means rent regulations. Yes, because this is one of the possibility. We don't have rent regulations here. We don't have very strong rent regulations in Brazil, but we do have rent regulation in several cities of United States, and that has provided indeed the possibility of protecting people from being priced out of cities like New York for many years. So I think it's not the solution, but I think it's one of the discussions and measures, and it depends on how much is a city of renters or a city of homeowners, how much is a city that is shrinking or a city that is growing. It depends on the dynamics of the city, but I think it's relevant to discuss that.
I have to intervene on security of tenure. In Mexico years ago, I visited a magistrate who was dealing with eviction of tenants on behalf of landlords. And I said, well, what's your average turnover? How long does it take to get to court? And he pulled out a sample thing from his pile. 3 years. So a landlord, good or bad, I know not, was not being paid rent for 3 years because of security of tenure. The rental legislation in Mexico, Colombia, was dire. Meanwhile, in the informal settlements, the same rental legislation should have applied, but there was no security of tenure whatsoever. Where was the expansion in rental housing? In the informal sector. Because who in their right mind would invest in middle-class housing to rent if you couldn't evict the tenant? Mm-hmm. So I have major problems with security of tenure. Of course, in Britain, it is absolutely outrageous that you can be evicted for no fault whatsoever in less than a year. What do you do with your children's schooling? It's totally outrageous. But in Latin America, I'm afraid rental legislation did not work in two ways. One, because landlords could never evict even bad tenants. And in the informal sector, which is 50% of Bogota, 50% of Bogotanos are tenants. No rent control, eviction like mad, but they're at least increasing the housing supply. So there's one last question, and then
I'm not sure we are quite past the time.
Okay, we want to drink. We want to drink.
Yeah, maybe we can take it during the drinks.
Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for the speaking.